this forward 10mm bolt. Lower this lower 10mm bolt here. Go ahead and remove this bolt here. Remove this plastic clip. And remove this 10mm bolt right here, and then the one beside it. I'm going to go ahead and start disconnecting some of our connectors on top of the engine here. Press down on the tab, pull that out. On the bottom of this connector, there's a little tab you're going to press in and slide that off. On the side of this hose right here, there's a little green tab. You're going to push this over out of the notch. Simply pull that up and out of the way. Pop this harness out of the rubber tube. Using an 8mm socket and extension, going to remove the clamps off of the intake tube, or at least loosen these. Remove these 3 8mm bolts. We're going to use a small bar to go ahead and push this linkage or cable off of the linkage itself. Once it's pushed off, we can go ahead and pull that cable off like so. Lift up on our throttle linkage assembly. Using a 10mm wrench, I'm going to go ahead and remove the nut here. Once we remove this, we're going to reinstall that nut so we don't lose that. I'm going to remove our 2 10mm bolts holding the fuel rail in place. Let's go ahead and remove this harness connector tab. And then there's one right on this side here. Going to use our hose pliers here to help us twist that off gently. Want to be careful not to break that plastic tube neck there. Let's go ahead and pinch on this little tab on the side of our fuel injector harness there. I'm going to pinch that tab there and pull up, and repeat this for the other 3. This connector right here, we're going to use a pick, get underneath that little spring tab right here. And slide that connector off like so. On the side of the harness, there's going to be a plastic retainer clip. Separate that. And on the side of the valve cover stud, there's a little plastic lock. Slip that off. That'll loosen up that hose. There's a harness retainer pressed onto the valve cover stud. Just gently pull up on that and loosen that harness. On the side of the throttle body, there is an electric motor. There's a harness right here. Pinch the tab, pull that off. Right where this hose comes down, there's a little red retainer lock right here. We're just going to apply a little bit of downward pressure with a screwdriver. Pull up on that, and that should slip right out. I'm going to gently move our harness back. We're going to go ahead and grab our fuel rail. We're going to pull the fuel rail along with the 4 injectors. Going to gently tug away or towards you. Pull it away from the motor. If this doesn't come out easy for you, we're going to use a pair of pliers like this here. Gently go down by the injectors. I want to go ahead and work these out. So our injectors were being rather stubborn, pulling them out of the cylinder head, so we just used our pick and released the clips. I'm going to reach in here and release the clip on the side of the injector and just pull up on the rail itself. A little bit of fuel might dribble out of there. Just have a towel ready to go to pop one in there. You want to pay attention to the inside of your fuel rail. This one here has a little rubber O-ring in there. So I want to go ahead and pop that out. Be careful not to mark it up. Take our fuel rail and just pull this up and set it aside. We're going to put our O-ring back on the injector itself. Pop that on. This harness here has a little retainer clip to the intake manifold. We're going to just use that. Pop that harness free. And use our pry tool. Pull this clip out. Using our Torx bit, we're going to remove these two Torx bit screws here. I'm going to go ahead and remove these hoses off the intake manifold. I'm going to use our hose pliers here. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark these simple left and right to help me on installation. Go ahead and pull this hose off of this unit here and set this aside. I'm going to pull this hose out from the manifold. And I am going to tag it with a piece of tape, identifying what it goes to. On the side of the throttle body, there is a connector right here. Press in on that tab. I'm going to use a 10mm ratchet wrench. There's two upper bolts here. I'm going to go ahead and loosen and remove these here. I'm going to do the same for this one right here. Once that bolt is loose, we'll go ahead and work that out. And there's a bolt right here, right behind the throttle body. I'm going to go ahead and now remove that lower bolt down below on the intake. Using a 50mm wrench, we're going to go into the serpentine belt tensioner, release the tension, and we're going to remove the serpentine belt. Release that back up. I'm going to loosen this 13mm bolt on the top of the AC compressor. I'm going to remove these two lower 13mm bolts. We're going to use a small pry bar just to jog the air compressor free here. Going to lower this unit down gently. I want to go ahead and use a T25 Torx bit to remove this screw. This clamp holds the oil dipstick tube to the intake manifold. So I want to go ahead and remove that screw. All right, we'll go ahead and spin this screw out. And what we're doing is just shocking the metal a little bit, just to try and break some of the rust free. We did apply some rust penetrant to it. I'm going to grab the hose. We do have some movement. Going to grab a pair of pliers. These here have a little notch in them here. so it won't be crushing the line or the hose. And we're going to go ahead and wiggle this back and forth. And now we're going to rotate it while pulling up on it. And just try and work our way around to try and pop this up. Now once we have a little bit of a lip available here, we're actually going to use a screwdriver to try and just kind of tap up and work our way around. And you can see there's an O-ring on there. Let's go ahead and pull that dipstick tube down. Let's go ahead and get this lower bolt out here. We'll go ahead and spin that out. Now this bolt right here, this is under the lower part of the manifold on the passenger side. I want to go ahead and get to that and remove that one. And I just dropped it. It's resting right on the water neck here, and there we go. And on the lower portion of the intake manifold on the driver's side, there is this bolt here. I'm going to go ahead and loosen and remove this one. We're going to remove this connector right here by pressing it on the tab and pulling the connector off. I'm going to go ahead and remove this connector off the oil pressure switch right here. This too has a little tab on the bottom.
You're good.
This harness we want to remove off of the bolt. It's just a retainer tab. I'm going to disconnect this harness from the intake. There's just a little plastic clip there holding it in place. We're going to use a long pick here to press in on the tab on the fan connector. I'm going to press in and pop this out. This is going to allow for us to get our tool into the hole on the intake manifold here. Down in front center of the exhaust, the intake manifold here, there is a hole in the very center. You're going to want to use 1/4-inch sockets and extensions. You're going to have to feed it into the hole and connect extensions as you go in. Now we're at the point of pulling the intake manifold. We do want to actually get our injectors out now. So you can go ahead and grab the injectors, gently wobble them around like so. Get those out. At this point here, we just want to try and get our harnesses and connectors and stuff out of the way. That'll give us some mobility to go ahead and lift this intake up and out of the way. Use a 22mm wrench to go ahead and remove the EGR tube right here. Without removing this here, you won't be able to lift the intake up and away. Need to reach down and grab this connector right here. Pop that off like so. There's another hose that runs underneath the throttle body and comes around to the front side of the intake manifold. So I'm just using my hose pliers here. I'm going to go ahead and wiggle that off. On the bottom side of the intake manifold, there is a PCV hose right here that is on a clip. I want to go ahead and pop the hose free of being clipped to the intake manifold. Here is your EGR tube connector right here. Just going to pinch on this little tab and work this off like so. This is the same hose that is attached to the back firewall, but we couldn't get to it when the intake was lower. So you can pop this off now. On the back lower side of the intake manifold, there is a rubber hose here with the hose clamp. I'm going to go ahead and loosen that clamp, slide it back, and pull the hose off. So we used a large pick, just kind of work that hose off, and now what we're going to do is take this hose here, and this is on your PCV. Go ahead and just spin that out of the way. Use your pliers. Loosen that clamp. Work that back. And then we're going to go ahead and pull this off. If the hose is stuck, go ahead and use your pliers. Gently apply a little bit of pressure to loosen this. Once it spins free, go ahead and work that right off. Take your new hose, line that up. Go ahead and work that into position. Grab the back of this little red tab here, pull, and the clamp will lock automatically. I'm going to use a small pick. I'm going to go ahead and remove the intake gasket seals. Now, if your gaskets seem okay, you can go ahead and reuse them. Ours are a little bit worn and flattened out, so we're going to go ahead and replace these. I'm just going to take the intake, shake any debris off of it. Next, we want to go ahead and clean the surface. Upon reinstallation, the seals have a little tab on there, and they should match up with a little notch on the intake manifold. Repeat this installation for all of the seals. Get the tab lined up, press it into place, and then press the O-ring in. This bolt hole is the lower center bolt that is a bugger to get to. What I'm going to do is we're going to feed this bolt through now. You see it's actually just a pain to get through now. We're going to feed that through, and I'm going to take a piece of tape that I actually put a little X through it and pop that on, and I'm just going to tape that through like so. That is going to hold the bolt in place. You can still spin it, but that bolt won't fall out. It's not going to interfere with our gaskets or our sealing because the tape is thin enough. And I'm going to go ahead and install this now. As we're going to lower the intake down inside, we're then going to attach our PCV while it's halfway in. As we lower the intake the rest of the way, I'm going to pull the hose out through the other side and up to the firewall, and then we'll continue to lower the intake down into position. As you're doing this, be careful not to damage the intake gaskets as you lower it, so be careful as you lower this down. So we now have got our tube threaded back into the cylinder head. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. Now we're going to go ahead and install the lower hose on the back side of the intake, and then we'll put our clamp on there. Now we're going to position our hose clamp, and we're going to pull the little red lock tab off of that, and that'll be secured in place. going to go ahead and put our 2 upper bolts in just to line up the intake. We're not going to tighten them. We're just going to try and get the threads caught. I'm going to start by using one of the longer bolts on the upper part of the intake manifold. We're going to push it in, and what we're going to do is we're going to use this just to hang the manifold. Get that started, just a few threads, and that's it. We're going to try and get one on the back over here on the top. All right, that'll line up our intake manifold. Now what we're going to do is we're going to double check through the top here, make sure our gaskets are still properly placed, and then we're going to try and get that lower center bolt started. That way we can see the hole and make sure that we're getting that threaded in. Let's go ahead and install our other top bolt here. This next bolt is going to go underneath this bolt right here. You have to go between the 2 pieces of plastic here on the intake and get it underneath. To hold the bolt, I simply put a piece of masking tape on the top to make it a little bit tighter fit. That'll hold it so it won't fall off. I'll feed my extension down through. On the right side lower part of the intake, I'm going to go ahead and get this bolt lined up. It's one of the longer bolts. And go ahead and get the thread started. So here we have the passenger side lower intake manifold bolt. It's sitting in the hole. We just need to thread it in. The standard bolts that you're going to have are these shorter ones here. This semi-long one is going to go at the base of the intake right down here. Once you get all of your intake bolts in and snug down, we're going to go ahead and torque them down to 13 foot-pounds. Now your harness here has 2 connectors. You want to feed this down in front. While we're doing so, we want to take our fan connector. We can actually go ahead and reconnect that right now. And there it is, clipped into place. We're now going to take our fuel rail and we need to feed it underneath this harness. And we're not going to install it yet, but we just want to make sure that it is in its correct position for installation later. Go ahead and take your upper connector and line that up. And that'll clip on. And take our oil pressure harness right here, line that up on the connector, press that on. That'll clip in, and take your tab right here and press that on like that. This vacuum line here, we had marked it feed through manifold. It goes underneath out towards the front like so. And with that being routed properly, go ahead and peel our tape off. And go ahead and install our unit right here. Install our Torx bit screws. You can just snug these down. We had tagged this hose with an L, so it goes to the left port, or left vacuum port on the intake. We had this vacuum hose, label is R or right. So it's going to go to our right side port. And we have our vacuum line here that ran underneath the intake. Pop that on there and install our connector. Now I went ahead and installed our fuel injectors into the fuel rail. Now I'm going to go ahead and line these up. I'm going to press these injectors back into the head. Let's go ahead and install our fuel injector, our fuel rail bolts. I'm going to line up our plastic tree right here, press that in. I'm going to do the same right here. Push that in. Let's go ahead and install our vacuum port right here. Connect our connector up top. That'll clip in. Let's go ahead and install our injector harness. I'm going to go ahead and install our little plastic push pin here. It's a retainer. There's a series of these for your electrical harnesses and vacuum lines. Be sure to go back and install all of those. Go ahead and install our cam sensor. Install your throttle body connector right here. Install your idle air control harness. I'm going to go ahead and feed our oil dipstick tube up from below. We did apply a light coat of engine oil to the O-ring on that to help this slide in. And while you're working that in, you want to go ahead and get ready to line up that bracket up top. We're going to go ahead and install our Torx bit screw to hold the oil dipstick. We'll snug that down by hand. And go ahead and spin up our AC unit here. Just going to get one of our lower bolts threaded in and started. I'm going to pretty much hold it for us while we get the other bolts in. We'll get that threaded, and then we'll get the upper bolt installed. Now we have the upper bolt in by hand and threaded a little bit. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten these down. We'll install our serpentine belt. Our throttle cable here itself has a slotted hole and it goes into a larger hole. We're going to line this up with the post on our throttle here. It presses in and then you pull it up and it locks into place. Take our 8mm bolts. Line them up on the bracket here, get those installed. We'll snug them down and tighten them up. Remove that 10mm nut that we popped on there upon removal. And our bracket put on there. We'll install that nut and snug it down. And to install our harness retainers, they pop onto the valve cover studs. There's one there, one on the front. Then we have our retainer clip here. Pop this into place. This will keep the lines from dragging on the pulleys in the belt. Let's now go ahead and install our air intake tube. Squeeze that onto the throttle body and onto the air box. Go ahead and install our port right here. Should press down and clip right on. Let's go ahead and tighten up our hose clamps here. Now take your vacuum supply hose, line that up, just push it in, and it'll lock itself in position. Now I want to go ahead and install our driver's side splash guard. And get our two 10mm bolts started in here. And once we have them started, we can go ahead and snug those down. Go ahead and install your bolts here. You want to finish installing your bolts across the front of the spoiler. Install the passenger side splash guard. Get the back bolt started.